Bueno, espero que se me esté escuchando. Voy a iniciar un nuevo libro que se llama Percy Jackson y los... eh, bueno, es que está en inglés, entonces es Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief. Espero que pues, les guste esta historia, es nueva. Entonces, ok. To Haley, who heard the story first. Bueno, esto en inglés, o sea, esto es también para enseñar mi inglés y pues mi lectura, ¿no? 1. I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher. Look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. If you're reading this because you think you might be one, my advice is close this book right now. Believe whatever lie your mom or dad told you about your birth and try to lead a normal life. Being a half-blood is dangerous. It's scary. Most of the time, it gets you killed in painful, nasty ways. If you're a normal kid reading this because you think it's fiction, great. Read on. I envy you for being able to believe that none of this ever happened. But if you recognize yourself in these pages, if you feel something stirring inside, stop reading immediately. You might be one of us. And once you know that, it's only a matter of time before they sense it too. And they'll come for you. Don't say I didn't warn you. My name is Percy Jackson. I'm 12 years old. Until a few months ago, I was a boarding student at Yancey Academy, a private school for troubled kids in upstate New York. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you could say that. I could start at any point in my short, miserable life to prove it, but things really started going bad last May, when our 6th grade class took a field trip to Manhattan. 28 mental case kids and 2 teachers on a yellow school bus heading to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at ancient Greek and Roman stuff. I know, it sounds like torture. Most Yancey field trips were. But Mr. Brunner, our Latin teacher, was leading this trip, so I had hopes. Mr. Brunner was this middle-aged guy in a motorized wheelchair. He had thin hair and scruffy beard and a frayed tweed jacket, which always smelled like coffee. You wouldn't think he'd be cool, but he told stories and jokes and let us play games in class. He also had this awesome collection of Roman armor and weapons, so he was the only teacher whose class didn't put me to sleep. I hoped the trip would be okay. At least, I hoped that for once I wouldn't get in trouble. Boy, was I wrong. See, bad things happened to me on field trips, like in my 5th grade school, when we went to a Saratoga battlefield. I had this accident with a Revolutionary War cannon. I wasn't aiming for the school bus, but of course I got expelled anyway. And before that, at my 4th grade school, when we took a behind the scenes tour of the Marine Wolf Shark Pool, I sort of hit the wrong lever on the catwalk and our class took an unplanned swim. And the time before that, well, you got the idea. This trip, I was determined to be good. All the way into the city, I put up with Nancy Bobofit, the freckly, red-headed kleptomaniac girl, hitting my best friend Groover in the back of the head with chunks of peanut butter and ketchup sandwich. Groover was an easy target. He was scrawny. He cried when he got frustrated. Been t- he must been held back several grades because he was the only 6th grader with acne and the start of a wispy beard on his chin. On top of all that, he was crippled. He had a note excusing him from PE for the rest of his life because he had some kind of muscular disease in his legs. He walked funny, like every step hurt him, but don't let that fool you. You should have seen him run when it was enchilada day in the cafeteria. Anyway, Nancy Bobofit was throwing a wax of sandwich that stuck in his curly brown hair, and she knew I couldn't do anything back to her because I was already on probation. The headmaster had threatened me with death by school suspension if anything bad, embarrassing, or even mildly entertaining happened on this trip. I'm going to kill her, I mumbled. Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay, I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy's lunch. That's it. I started to get up, but Grover pulled me back to my seat. You're already on probation, he reminded me. You know who'll get blamed if anything happens. Looking back on it, I wish I decked Nancy Bobofit right then and there. A school suspension would be nothing compared to the mess I was about to get myself into. Mr. Brunny led me to museum tour. He rode up front in his wheelchair, guiding us through the big echoey galleries, past marble statues and glass cases full of really old black and orange pottery. It blew my mind that this stuff had survived for 2,000, 3,000 years. He gathered us around a 13-foot tall stone column with a big sphinx on the top and started telling us how it was a grave marker, a stele for a girl about our age. He told us about the carvings on the sides. I was trying to listen to what he had to say because it was kind of interesting, but everybody around me was talking, and every time I told them to shut up, the other teacher chaperone, Mrs. Dodds, would give me the evil eye. Mrs. Dodds was his little math teacher from Georgia who always wore a black leather jacket, even though she was 50 years old. She looked mean enough to ride a Harley right into your locker. She had come to Yancey halfway through the year when our last math teacher had a nervous breakdown. From her first day, Mrs. Dodds loved Nancy Bobofit and figured I was devil's pawn. She would point her crooked finger at me and say, "Now, honey, real sweet," and I knew I was going to get after school detention for a month. One time, after she'd made me erase answers out of all math workbooks until midnight, I told Grover I didn't think Mrs. Dodds was human. He looked at me. He looked at me, real serious, and said, "You're absolutely right." Mr. Brunner kept talking about Greek funeral art. Finally, Nancy Bobofit snickered something about the naked guy on the steel, and I turned around and said, "Will you shut up?" It came out louder than I meant it to. The whole group laughed. Mr. Brunner stopped his story. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "do you have a comment?" My face was totally red. I said, "No, sir." Mr. Brownie pointed to the one of picture on the steel. "Perhaps you'll tell us what this picture represents." I looked at the carving and felt a flush of relief because I actually recognized it. "That's Cronus eating his kids, right?" "Yes," Mr. Brunner said, obviously not satisfied. "And he did this because, well, I racked my brain to remember. Cronus was the king god and god?" Mr. Brunny asked. "Titan," I correct myself. "And he didn't trust his kids, who were the gods. So, Cronus ate them, right? But his wife hid baby Zeus and gave Cronus a rock to eat instead. And later, when Zeus grew up, he tricked his dad, Cronus, into barfing up his brothers and sisters." "Ew," said one of the girls behind me. "And so there was this big fight between the gods and the titans," I continued, "and the gods won." Some snickers from the group. Behind me, Nancy Bobofit mumbled to a friend, "Like we're going to use this in real life, like it's going to say on our job applications. Please explain why Kronos hate these kids." "And why, Mr. Jackson," Bruno said, "to paraphrase Miss Bobofit's excellent question, does this matter in real life?" "Busted," Grover muttered. "Shut up," Nancy hissed, her face even brighter red than her hair. At least Nancy got packed too. Mr. Brunner was the only one who ever caught her saying anything wrong. He had her redder hairs. I thought about his question and shrugged. "I don't know, sir." "I see." Mr. Brunner looked disappointed. "Well, half credit, Mr. Jackson. Zeus did indeed feed Kronos a mixture of mustard and wine, which made him disgorge his other 5 children, who, of course, being mortal gods, had been living and growing up completely undigested in the Titan's stomach. The gods defeated their father, sliced him to pieces with his own scythe, and scattered his remains in the Tartarus, the darkest part of the underworld. On that happy note, it's time for lunch. Mrs. Dodds, will you lead us back outside?" The class drifted off, the girls holding their stomachs, the guys pushing each other around and acting like doofuses. Griffin and I were about to follow when Mr. Brunner said, "Mr. Jackson." I knew that was coming. I told Grover to keep going. Then I turned toward Mr. Brunner. "Sir?" Mr. Brunner had this look that wouldn't let you go. Intense brown eyes that could have been 1,000 years old and had seen everything. You must learn the answer to my question," Mr. Brunner told me. "About the Titans, about real life, and how your studies apply to it." "Oh, oh, what you learn from me," he said, "is vitally important. I expect you to treat it as such. I will accept only the best from you, Percy Jackson." I want to get angry. This guy pushed me so hard. I mean, sure, it was kind of cool on tournament days when he dressed up in a suit of Roman armor and shouted, "What ho!" and challenged O's. Sword point against chalk to run to the board and name every Greek and Roman person who had ever lived and their mother and what god they worshipped. But Mr. Brunner expected me to be as good as everybody else, despite the fact that I have dyslexia and attention deficit disorder and I have never made above a C minus in my life. No, he didn't expect me to be as good, he expected me to be better. And I just couldn't learn how those names are facts, much less spell them correctly. I mumbled something about trying harder while Mr. Brunner took one long sad look at Still like he'd been at this girl's funeral. He told me to go outside. He told me to go outside and eat my lunch. The class gathered out the Lo siento. The class gathered on the front steps of the museum, where we could watch the foot traffic along Fifth Avenue. Overhead, a huge storm was brewing, with clouds, blacker than I had ever seen over the city. I figured maybe it was global warming or something, because the weather all across New York State had been weird since Christmas. We'd had a massive snowstorms, flooding, wildfires from lightning strikes. I wouldn't have been surprised if this was a hurricane blowing in. Nobody else seemed to notice. Some of the guys were pelting pigeons with Lunchables crackers. Nancy Bubblefeet was trying to pickpocket something from a lady's purse, and, of course, Mrs. Dodds wasn't seeing a thing. Ruth and I sat on the edge of the fountain away from the others. We thought that maybe if we did that, everybody would know we were from that school, the school for loser freaks who couldn't make it elsewhere. Detention? Ruth asked. Nah, I said. Not from Brunner. I just wish he'd lay off me sometimes. I mean, I'm not a genius. Groover didn't say anything for a while. Then, when I thought he was going to give me some deep philosophical comment to make me feel better, he said, "Can I have your apple?" I didn't have much of an appetite, so I let him take it. I watched the stream of cabs going down Fifth Avenue, and thought about my mom's apartment only a little ways uptown from where we sat. I hadn't seen her since Christmas. I wanted so bad to jump in a taxi and head some. She'd hug me and be glad to see me, but she'd be disappointed too. She'd send me right back to Yancey, remind me that I had to try harder, even if this was my sixth school in 6 years. I was probably going to be kicked out again. I wouldn't be able to stand that sad luck she'd give me. Mr. Brunner parked his wheelchair at the base of the handicap ramp. He ate celery while he read a paperback novel. A red umbrella stuck up from the back. A red umbrella stuck up from the back of his chair, making it look like a motorized Cafe table. I was about to unwrap my lunch when Nancy Bobofit appeared in front of me with their ugly friends. I guess she'd gotten tired of stealing from the tourists and dumped her half-eaten lunch in Grover's lap. Whoops! She grinned at me with her crooked teeth. Her freckles were orange, as if somebody had spray painted her face with liquid cheetahs. I tried to stay cool. The school counselor had told me a million times. Count to 10, get control of your temper. But I was so mad my mind went blank. A wave roared in my ears. I don't remember touching her, but the next thing I knew, Nancy was sitting on her butt in the fountain screaming, "Percy pushed me!" Mrs. Dodds materialized next to us. Some of the kids were whispering, "Did you see the water? Like it grabbed her." I didn't know what they were talking about. All I knew was that I was in trouble again. As soon as Mrs. Dodds was sure to As soon as Mrs. Dodds was sure poor little Nancy was okay, promising to get her a new shirt at the museum gift shop, etc., Mrs. Dodds turned on me. There was a triumph and fire in her eyes, as if I'd done something she'd been waiting for all semester. "Now, honey, I know, I, gr- I know," I grumbled. "I'm only erasing workbooks." That wasn't the right thing to say. "Come with me," Mrs. Dodd said. "Wait!" Grover yelled. "It was me. I pushed her." I stared at him, stunned. I couldn't believe he was trying to cover for me. Mrs. Dodd scared Grover to death. She glared at him so hard his whiskety chin trembled. I don't think so, Mr. Underwood, she said. But you will stay here. Grover looked at me despairingly. It's okay, ma'am, I told him. Thanks for trying. Honey, Mr. Dodd barked at me. Now. Nancy boldly smirked. I gave her my deluxe I'll kill you later stare. Then I turned to face Miss Dodds, but she wasn't there. She was standing at the museum entrance, way at the top of the steps, gesturing impatiently at me to come on. How did she get there so fast? I have moments like that a lot when my brain falls asleep or something, and the next thing I know I've missed something as if a puzzle piece fell out of the universe and left me staring at the blank place behind it. The school counselor told me this was part of the ADHD, my brain misinterpreting things. I wasn't so sure. I went after Miss Dodds. Halfway up the steps, I glanced back at Grover. He was looking pale, cutting his eyes between me and Mr. Brunner, like he wanted Mr. Brunner to notice what was going on, but Mr. Brunner was absorbed in this novel. I looked back up. Mrs. Dodds had disappeared again. She was now inside the building, at the end of the entrance hall. Okay, I thought, she's going to make me buy a new shirt for Nancy at the gift shop. But apparently, that wasn't the plan. I followed her deep into the museum. When I finally caught up to her, we were back in the Greek and Roman section. Except for us, the gallery was empty. Miss Dodds stood with her arms crossed in front of a big marble frieze of the Greek gods. She was making this weird noise in her throat, like growling. Even without the noise, I would have been nervous. It's weird being alone with a teacher, especially Mrs. Dodds. Something about the way she looked at the frieze, as if she wanted to pulverize it. You've been giving us problems, honey, she said. I did the same thing. I said, Yes, Mom. She tugged on the cuffs of her leather jacket. Did you really think you would get away with it? The look in her eyes was beyond mad. It was evil. She's a teacher, I thought nervously. It's not like she's going to hurt me. I said, I'll try hard. I try hard, man. Thunder shook the building. We're not fools, Percy Jackson, Mrs. Dodds said. It was only a matter of time before we found you out. Confess, and you will suffer less pain. I didn't know what she was talking about. All I could think of was that was all ah, all I could think of was that the teacher's must found the illegal stash of candy I've been selling out of my dorm room. Or maybe they'd realized that I got my essay on Tom Sawyer from the internet without ever reading the book, and now they were going to take away my grade. Or worse, they were going to make me read the book. Well, she demanded. Ma'am, I don't. Your time is up. She hated. Then the weirdest thing happened. Her eyes began to glow like barbecue coals. Her fingers stretched, turning into talons. Her jacket melting into large, leathery wings. She wasn't human. She was a shriveled hag with bat wings and claws and mouth full of yellow fangs, and she was about to slide me into ribbons. Then things got even stranger. Mr. Bruni, who'd been out in front of the museum a minute before, wheeled his chair into the doorway of the gallery, holding a pen in his hand. What ho, Percy! He shouted, and tossed the pen through the air. Miss Dodds slung at me. With a yelp, I dodged and fair talon slashed the air next to my ear. I snatched the ballpoint pen out of the air, but when it hit my hand, it wasn't a pen anymore. It was a sword. Mr. Brunner's bronze sword, which he always used on tournament days. Mrs. Dodds spun toward me with a murderous look in her eyes. My knees were jelly. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the sword. She snarled, Die, honey! And she flew straight at me. Absolutely terror ran through my body. I did the only thing that came naturally. I swung the sword. The metal blade hit her shoulder and passed clean through her body as if she were made of water. Hiss! Mrs. Dodds was a sand castle in a power fan. She exploded into yellow powder, vaporized it on the spot, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and a dying screech and a chill of evil in the air, as if those two glowing red eyes were still watching me. I was alone. There was a ballpoint pen in my hand. Mr. Browning wasn't there. Nobody was there but me. My hands were still trembling. My lunch must have been contaminated with magic mushroom or something. Had I imagined the whole thing? I went back outside. It had started to rain. Grover was sitting by the fountain, a museum map turned over his head. Nancy Bobofit was still standing there, soaked from her swim in the fountain, grumbling to her ugly friends. When she saw me, she said, "I hope Mrs. Kerr whipped your butt." I said, "Who?" "Our teacher, duh." I blinked. We had no teacher named Mrs. Kerr. I asked Nancy. I asked Nancy what she was talking about. She just rolled her eyes and turned away. I asked Grover where Mrs. Dutz was. He said, "Who?" But he paused first, and he wouldn't look at me, so I thought he was messing with me. "Not funny, man," I told him. "This is serious." Thunder boomed overhead. I saw Mr. Brunner sitting under his red umbrella, reading his book, as if never moved. I went over to him. He looked up, a little distracted. "Ah, that will be my pen. Please bring your own writing utensils in the future, Mr. Jackson." I handed Mr. Brunner his pen. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it. "Sir," I said, "where's Miss Dodds?" He stared at me blankly. "Who?" "The other, the, the other chaperone, Miss Dodds. The pre-algebra teacher?" He frowned and sat forward looking mildly concerned. "Percy, there is no Miss Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there has never been a Miss Dodds at Yancy Academy. Are you feeling all right?" Y eso fue el capítulo 1 de Percy Jackson. Espero que les haya gustado. La verdad, corríjanme si tengo todos o sea, si no lo hice bien, si no hablé bastante chido, pues corríjanme. Eso es para eso estoy, para eso está esto. Espero que les haya gustado. Nos vemos en el capítulo 2.